Yes, well, I mean, that's a great triple question, so I'll make sure I maintain everything in my mind and get round to it. Um, and yes, the multi-supplier point is important. But again, for our business, because we sell into the medical market, everything has to be, and the medical market in Europe, everything has to go through the good manufacturing process that is what the European Medicines Agency considers the right way to produce medicines. And so this means in terms of supplier choice, actually, we're far more limited than perhaps someone who was able to go everywhere and look at everything. So that creates slightly different problems. And it's also dependent on the regulator which part of the process has to start from GMP. So in our regulation from our Düsseldorf office, we need to make sure when we have oil extracts that not only is the extraction, manufacturing, and bottling done in a GMP facility, but also the harvest from cultivation to drying has to be done through a GMP process. So I guess the others might speak to how do you select when you've got a wider variety of choices, because us, it's actually, there's quite a small list of places you can source from. And that's growing day by day. So I mean, you can look in the GMP register and see who's registered with a GMP cannabis facility all over the world. And there's certain authorities like the Australian Therapeutic Goods Agency that is considered from a European perspective the same. So if the TGA says you're GMP, then the European Medical Agency says you're GMP, which isn't the same for Canada, actually. So in Canada, if you're a Canadian GMP grower, you actually have to get your GMP certificate provided by a third-party country. So for us, it's when we find the right supplier, it's like, how do we know that they are going to be committed and really make this work? Because there's a lot of different options for a cannabis cultivator to go down, and a lot of different business models. And I think this speaks to the multi-supplier model you mentioned. But one of our first suppliers, who we helped to get a GMP certificate in Canada, just at the point of growing for us and about to start our first imports, decided to make a pivot basically, and thought that actually the American market is a lot more attractive than the early European market. So rather than invest a lot in GMP grows for Europe, I will be looking how I can operate in an American context. And so from a supplier point of view, I really think our experience is not going to be unique. And if you're dependent on suppliers, you're going to want two or three, just because you can't have that single point of failure, especially when these supply chains take so long to validate and secure. Because I can't just, oh, you're not going to sell me my GMP cannabis, I'll just go next door and buy it. I have to really get into bed with the supplier. There's technical agreements, there's compliance agreements. They're generally in another country, so our regulators are talking to theirs. And so there's a whole degree in which you really need the insurance of having a multi-supplier model. And I'm sure that in Stephanie and Jeremy's worlds, it's probably very similar.
Agreed. And this is a long-term relationship. We still have so much to uncover and understand with this entire plant. And so you want to be able to grow and cultivate the relationship. And so we start with site visits. We only work with a few different manufacturers, again, ensuring we have the highest certifications, GMP being one of them. But I want to be actually physically there. I just visited our recent manufacturer because we're planting. May is our planting season. And I want to be there before the seeds go in. And I think having that accessibility is so critical as well. This is a very, very unique plant because the soil and how this plant contributes to the soil all the way to extraction and process and manufacturing, there's a story to be told. And so you want to make sure your partner is really aligned with the story that you are telling, because all of us sitting here, all of us who will be attending and listening, are working towards a different part of the story of this plant. And I think that's also a critical part of the courtship, the matchmaking. Not everyone's going to be the right fit, and you want to make sure your manufacturer is fitting your why.
Yeah, so for my company, we don't necessarily have to have the same level of GMP as Oscar was talking about. We're not really going to a pharmaceutical market, but we do look for those traits. We look for HACCP plans and SQF plans, and we actually have a whole compliance team that it's not good enough for us to get this documentation. So like Stephanie alluded to, we actually go on site as well. So one of the things, and I actually would be interested in my panelists' opinions about this, in the US, GMP is kind of a tricky thing, right? Because it's essentially a federal certification, a federal stamp, and the federal government doesn't recognize cannabis for the most part. So you have companies that are saying they're GMP, but we don't know that they're being audited, right? So it's one thing to say you're GMP. It's another thing to actually be, executing all these protocols in your GMP plan. So that's kind of part of the reason why we do want to go on site and take a second look and make sure that people are being transparent. So anyway, and the multiple supplier thing, we've run into this problem a lot, and COVID actually really threw a kink in our supply chain, not just for cannabis, but for mango butter, for beeswax, for everything. So we've really been diligent in trying to line up multiple suppliers, and each of these suppliers has to kind of go through the same vetting process that we've been talking about here, in terms of validating that they're doing what they say that they're doing and providing the highest quality raw materials.
Yes, to your point, we are creating the standard at this point, all of us together. And those are the brands and the scientists and the individuals who are going to keep the bar at a standard. And the nice thing is we're in the age of technology. So we have the option to use technology to help us keep traceability at top of mind, because traceability really helps with the regulation. To Jeremy's point, we think of the words organic. There still isn't certification in the United States for true organic cannabis standards. And so what are your manufacturers using? And those ongoing conversations are so critical, because in a way, we're creating this as we're going and ensuring that the highest standard is being met, so that anyone who's not going to play by the rules, it kind of falls by the wayside. We owe the consumer that, we owe the industry that, and most importantly, we owe this plant to be sure that the bar is raised as high as possible. Technology is a whole other piece of how this plant is really is just booming right now.
I just wanted to add some thoughts to both panelists who mentioned the importance of insight visits, and I think that is just paramount. To give an example, we were looking at a supplier within the EU that had quite a nice little cultivation set up. Everything sounded good and looked good on the plans. And then when we went down to view it, we noticed that it looked a bit like the roof may have been made with asbestos. And this isn't the kind of thing that a supplier is going to say, oh, we've retrofitted this old facility that was made at a time when asbestos was legal or what have you. But it does mean that, okay, let's say we fell in love with these suppliers and we want them to start expanding their production. It wouldn't be possible for them to do that on the same site, because you don't want to open an asbestos roof. And at a deeper level, maybe you worry that there are some structural problems there. So there really is nothing that compare with going to see how the supplying is done, because you can have all the documents you want and there's lots of tech to help with it, but you don't know the unknown unknowns until you're looking around. So I agree with both my panelists there.
Yeah.